Bonjour, bonjour, mes amis. It is wonderful to have you here with us this evening, where we are going to be diving into all things diet. And in the true spirit of DNA Company, we're not just going to be looking at food and we're not just going to be telling you to eat less and exercise more. We're going to be exploring what your genes have to say about the way you should be eating, from everything in the sort of food that you're eating, the appetite, the satiety, kind of the emotional, the touchy-feely that goes alongside food, and the biome of it. Because if you can't personalize your diet, why even bother? I'm joined this evening by our most wonderful Justin Harris. Good evening, sir. How are you doing?
Good evening, Dr. K. Good evening, everybody. I love this topic. This is a gooder, right? Because everything eats every one of us. And 3 times a day, let's say every day, we have the opportunity to present epigenetic input into our body, and eating is an epigenetic signal. Not eating is an epigenetic signal. The way we eat, volume of it, the type of food that we select, all of these things are signals and information that our body is going to take and it's going to do something with it. It might do something good, it might do something not so good. And it's really dependent on the choice that we make and how informed that choice is in the first place. I think that
Yeah.
diet is really funny, especially because there's this concept of option paralysis, where there's so many things to choose from that you end up just not even wanting to open the can of worms. There's so many different things you can select. Oh, the
Yeah.
Malibu diet, the Long Beach diet. Like when it gets to the point where every city has a diet named after it, it's going to be pretty hard to personalize it. So we need tools, right? We need certain ways that
Yeah.
we can kind of zoom in on what's appropriate for each and every person. And genes, I mean, that's a great strategy and a great tool that we use for personalization. So the DNA
Yeah.
360, folks, that's where you're going to find some answers.
Yeah, I'm curious, audience. One of the more amusing things that I'll tally, as I work with patients is how many diets they've tried over the course of their life. So, audience, I would love it if you're able, just toss into the chat a number, and I want to know how many different diets you've tried over the course of your life. Because I'm finding on average most people, and I want to acknowledge the number for women tends to be a bit higher, because this is traditionally it was marketed just to us. Now I think it's to many, to everyone. But women, I usually see they've tried five, six, seven, especially older generations, and men are still high. Yeah. So Justin, we're looking at the numbers here, and we're seeing everything from zero. Good job for those that haven't bowed. I'm seeing some eights. Yep. Yeah, the higher numbers with the women in particular. Yeah, so everyone's kind of been victim to this idea that um, a book or a trend is going to tell us how to live properly for our diet, as opposed to our own innate awareness of our body and our genes. So let's jump right into it. Um, mon
I
Dieu,
saw
I am
12.
seeing some of 12. Good
Whew.
sir. Well, hopefully we can offer you some awareness and support this evening as to how to personalize that number just down to one. So, Justin, I know, so this evening when we were talking, there are a few areas we want to cover. We definitely want to cover genes when it comes to what sorts of foods, right? And we want to cover genes in regards to the appetite and the feeling behind food. And we want to talk about biome because we'd be wholly remiss if we left out our second brain that really influences how we crave and how we want. So before we dive into all these nuances, why don't we talk a little bit around why genes speak to what sort of foods we could be wanting, but also separate to that, like why we crave foods? Because I think people sometimes, especially when they're dieting to the end of, I want to lose weight or I want to shift a health parameter, there becomes a very adversarial relationship. And this thing that it fuels us, everyone does it every day, but more or less, we kind of get this very angry relationship with food, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I love the topic because I must say, I kind of take issue with anybody who comes out with a diet book or whatever that says, like, this is the appropriate diet for humans. And I will admit that at one point I was actually somewhat guilty of that as far as like paleo recommendations and just saying, well, look at our ancestors and this is obviously what humans ought to be eating. humans,
Mhm.
right, that's a really big category because we know that different people
Mhm.
throughout history have had the capacity to thrive or at least survive on many, many different foods. Like the human body's so adaptable. You look at the Irish potato famine, and people were pretty much all the way down to eating shoe leather, literally, at certain points, and still surviving. Right. So, I
Yeah.
mean, people can eat certain things and we can survive on certain things, but survival and like optimal for what's best for your hormones and your brain and your gut microbiome, these are very different things. And another interesting nuance here is that when we talk about genes, understand that genes were really forged in this crucible of our ancestors, millennia, right? Thousands of years. And if we really zoom out on that and we look at like ancestral diets, even just how variable those are, right? So a good
Mhm.
example would be like the Incans. I think that there's more modern day cultures like Quechuan or something they're called. And it really stems from like the Mayan Empire and people that were really living there. They were thriving pretty well on like 2,000 species of potatoes and lots of quinoa and just tons of different tubers and starches and fruits and honey and all these things. Like quite a big portion of their diet came from carbohydrates. And
A
yet,
diet that we nowadays would vilify as like the Antichrist.
correct, correct. And yet, at the same time as that was taking place, when you go real north of the equator to the point where it's so cold that there's no real produce and vegetation being grown because it can't, there's
Mhm.
plenty of Inuit cultures that you could point to, or even like, I live in Canada, so do you. And northern Canada, I mean, a lot of those indigenous species are pretty much surviving on animals because that's what's there. A lot of
Yeah.
seal blubber and just high amounts of fat, some protein there, and very scarce produce. And yet, in both of these areas, you're seeing people that have no heart disease. I mean, very minimal, right?
Mhm.
Insulin resistance and diabetes, all of these things didn't occur until we started mishmashing the cultures together.
Yeah.
Once that infected everything, I mean, it's really sad, actually. You see a lot of, modern day tribes that actually do have pretty high rates of obesity and different things. But that's because they strayed from that ancestral diet. So, why did
Yeah.
some people thrive on starches and some people thrive on fats? It's because of the epigenetic input that was given to their bodies over millennia. It started to alter their enzyme expression, right? When I
Yeah.
say genes, I mean enzymes. Genes encode enzymes. So it's a similar conversation. They have the same namesake most of the time as well. So when we live in a certain area and many, many generations thrive on a particular macronutrient structure, it makes sense that their ancestors, being us, would actually thrive on the same thing. Part of the problem in identifying this is that you can't just go to Ancestry and be like, well, I'm Irish, so that means this, right? Because
You know,
as we go further and further back, all the way to Australopithecus, Homo habilis days, we don't really know. You're probably a hybrid of a whole bunch of different, areas and types, to where the best way for us to identify it now is for you to spit in a tube and send it to someone like the DNA company, and we can tell you what the genes and genotypes are, right? That gives you the indicator of the enzymes that you actually landed with, because it's a crazy trickle down effect for many, many generations. And you can land somewhere in the middle, like a hybrid,
Mhm.
right? Like I'll use myself as an example. So I have tons of ancestry, like, indigenous groups from Canada. I've actually got 3 different First Nations groups in my blood. I'm part Scottish. Shout out to our Captain Tracy. She's going to love that. Part English, part Irish. She's not going to love that. But so it gives you an indicator, right? That I can't just look at my ancestors that I know of and go, I should probably eat this.
Mhm.
There's too much
Mhm.
mishmashing going on there.
Mhm.
So instead, we rely on modern science and genes, right? That really
Yeah.
show us that kind of indicator to know, okay, how well do I digest starches versus fatty acids and everything in between? To your point,
Yeah.
I mean, we've even got genes like FTO and MC4R. These are the
Yeah.
satiety signaling genes that we look at. And we know that genetically, some people were in fact wired to have to try and seek out as many nutrition sources as humanly possible, right? To where it
Yeah.
actually altered the palate and some of these satiety signals that come from the gut or from the palate. So you can look at your genes and even understand some of that as well, which is a pretty
Yeah.
interesting thing that we do with our panels.
Yeah. And so, audience, this evening, what we're going to be doing is quite literally working through a few of these genes so that you can get a better understanding of if you have this presentation, this is what's happening in your body. And more importantly, this is how you can balance for it. And I want to be really emphatic because I think sometimes when people are navigating diet, navigating how do I leverage food to give me the body I want or give me the health I want, whatever the outcome you're seeking, there can be especially a moment where, like, if you're told, oh, you have a suboptimal presentation of FTO, which means you're always going to be overeating a little bit and not really feeling that satiation, I might as well throw in the towel. I really want you to know this up front. It does not mean you should be throwing in the towel. It educates you as to how can you shift what you're doing, how you're eating to avoid that pitfall. So, for example, I have across the board all the genes that we're talking about today that should lead to obesity. Categorically, I have them all, right? I should always be hungry. I should always be eating. But with that awareness, I change what my meals look like. So I leave my meal feeling exceptionally satiated and not in a place where I'm at risk for cardiometabolic disorder, at least at present, assuming I keep on keeping, right? So, audience, as we run through this, I want you to take this from the frame of learning how your body responds to food or how your body may be engaged with food, and then taking the wisdom of what can I do about it? And hear that from Justin, because bar none, Justin is the best we have when it comes to how do you actually translate this brilliant information into what do you do about it. He'll give you that very gentle little smack upside the head that says, go do it. So,
Man of
just
action.
sorry.
So a man of action, right? I like to make an actual action plan, and I'm a what do we do about it guy. Like, it's
Hmm.
great to talk about stuff, but then what do we do about it is where we need to arrive at, of course.
Yeah, I thought I heard action figure, and I had this little vision of you as an action figure, and I think we actually need to make that happen now. We need like a little action figure, Justin. Okay, so Justin, why don't we at least jump into the food-based ones first, and then we'll transition into some appetite and satiety ones. So when someone approaches you with their DNA 360 and they're like, "Cool, tell me about from a food perspective what guidance you can give me." Jump in a little bit there. Where do you start with?
So I always start where it starts. I mean, there's a reason why we have like everything segmented in the DNA 360, right? So we've got the executive function. That's a
Yeah.
great thing to know. That's actually the first thing I look at, regardless of anything that they're presenting with,
Mm,
because I want to know how they're going to accept the information I'm about to give them. So I look at
mm,
that. But when it comes more specificity to food, I look at something called TCF7L2 because that's really overarching as far as how difficult it's going to be to kind of dial in this person's macros. I'll tell you, it
mhm.
complicates the equation if your insulin response is suboptimal genetically at a baseline. And that's what that TCF7L2 gene does. It's a regulator there of that whole mechanism, right? So if you're already dysregulated for insulin coming out of the womb, then it means that it's going to be harder for you to adopt a straight ketogenic diet, like really on purpose, fat heavy, or a straight starch based bodybuilding diet. You're going to be the one that tends to be a little bit more fluffy in response to some of these macronutrient structures because of the blood sugar clearance issues that you're going to
Yeah,
potentially run into because of that. Now, these things are not diagnostic. It doesn't mean
correct.
diabetes is definitely on its way, but it's something that we need to consider, a red flag that we should be a little bit more careful for this individual, right? So I look at TCF7L2, but then that is married directly to our actual macronutrient digesting genes, right? So, for
Mhm.
example, AMY1 is really important. We call it AMY1, and it's a salivary amylase gene, right? So, in the saliva, there's a lot of enzymes and things in there. Your saliva changes your pH. It does a bunch, or not your pH, the food's pH, sorry. And it does a lot of things to sort of prep the food. And a lot of people have higher presences of this AMY1, salivary amylase, to where the baseline digestion of starches is different than it would be for someone who has a totally suboptimal presentation there, right? So we look at AMY1 for starches, and then we look at another one called ApoA2 for lipid
Mhm.
metabolism, right? And a lot of people, they have suboptimal presentation there to where the ketogenic diet that your neighbor lost all this weight on might not be appropriate for you. And you may cause
Yeah.
metabolic dysfunction by on purpose adopting a super fat heavy diet. Some people have medium presentations of these different things, and we have to adopt like a hybrid
Yeah.
strategy of like carb cycling or whatever. But those three are probably the most overarching. Do you look at something different, Dr. K?
No, I like that. No, I value that. I think though that's a really good start. And so audience, if you're looking to dive into those three that Justin just went over, if you go into the diet and nutrition section of the DNA 360, and just for ease of use, if you go into the system summary, you will see those three listed there. And then as you go into each module for carbohydrate, for fat, you'll be able to see, is your presentation optimal or not? Okay. So audience, if you need any support navigating your DNA 360, don't hesitate to toss a comment into the chat. Yeah. So Justin, I want to, like you asked me the question of what else I would consider, and we would both jump to start at least into mood and behavior, because to your point, that's where we're going to be thinking about appetite, and that's where we're going to be thinking about how is the person going to be receiving this. Before we do that, so audience, that's a prelude to a kiss here. Go to your mood and behavior section, grab that information, right? But before that, I wonder, Vanny or Julius, if either of you wouldn't mind pulling up our poll questions. Thank you so much. So audience, Justin and I show up solely for the purpose of supporting you in your health journey. We like to know what motivates you to come here and what you're seeking to learn. So I'm just going to go through our poll questions so that as we dive deeper into this, we can be speaking to what you want to know. I've seen some questions be tossed into the Q&A. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I really encourage they go into the Q&A as opposed to the chat. The chat's kind of more of a conversation between us. If you have content questions, please do put them in the Q&A. So for example, Peter, shout out to a fellow Torontonian. We'll be addressing your question a little later on, okay? Justin's smiling because I taught Justin that Toronto is the center of the world, and he didn't know that at first. And Canadians on the call are going to be laughing at that joke. Americans are going to say, "What are you talking about? It's definitely America that's the center of the world," and we can duke it out in a very friendly way. All right, so first question we asked is, how familiar are you with DNA-based nutrition? And so about 45% of our audience is kind of sitting in the somewhat. And then we actually have an equal 30 and 30, that 30% of our audience is saying very familiar, and 30% of our audience is saying not familiar at all. So especially for that 30% of the audience that is saying this is all very new to me, welcome. We're so grateful to have you. If you have any questions or things that you're trying to clarify as we go along, don't hesitate to type in the chat like, hey, you used a phrase I'm not familiar with. Please circle back to it. We want to make sure that we are supporting your learning as we go along. The next question we asked here is, what is the biggest challenge you face with nutrition and diet? The biggest things I'm seeing here, and I really value this, is number one, staying consistent, right? How do you keep on a diet versus, jumping on and off that proverbial bandwagon? The next is just knowing what's actually healthy. I'm not gonna front like I know better. Sometimes I struggle with that. I'm more 80% of the time now, but there's always new foods out there, which is interesting. The balance of the audience is saying managing cravings, I hear you, digestive issues, and then conflicting advice, which I think kind of goes alongside that idea of actually knowing what's healthy and what's up. The next question we asked an audience, we already saw this a little bit when he asked you how many diets have y'all been on. We asked what sort of diets have you tried just simply in the past 2 years. The most popular here was intermittent fasting. Audience, I'm curious, how many people are still intermittent fasting? And please also toss in your fasting window there. I'm always curious what window people are trying to keep when they do this intermittent fasting, whether they're taking it in I fast one day a week or I just don't eat between these hours. Other really popular diets that we're seeing here, paleo, keto. There's shout out to the vegetarians in the audience, and there's a few others. And for the others, toss them in the chat. I saw a few so close. Autoimmune paleos in the chat. And then I also saw some whole food plant-based as well. Yeah. The next question we asked was, have traditional diets been successful for you in the past? And most people are saying no to a little bit. So hopefully, I think we've already clarified that diets by themselves aren't going to work. We have to figure out that personalization. So hopefully by the end, you can do that a little bit more. Last question here, by far my favorite question that we're asking is, if DNA could reveal one thing about your health, what would you want that to be? And I think the bigger concerns here are going to be number one, what foods truly do serve me and help me thrive. And then the other one, and we'll make sure we speak to this, especially in this next part, when we talk about mood behavior and satiety, is why I gain weight easily. Just on that note, I'm grateful we read these poll questions because I think one thing that I'd want to offer people who are trying to understand why they gain weight easily, look at your AMY1 and look at your ApoA2. Suboptimal presentations there are really linked to if you, for example, if you have a suboptimal AMY1 and you're consuming a diet that is higher in carbohydrate, that is highly correlated with excessive weight gain, right? Same for ApoA2. And then next, what we're going to be is exploring our diets that influence satiety, and as well, genes that influence satiety, so close, and then genes that influence the emotional side of things. Both of these will also have big impact. So without me continuing on, dear Justin, would you like to explore some of the genes that influence, and you articulate this so well, satiety and overeating and kind of all the things that sit on that spectrum for our audience?
Yeah, and it's important to note that this really is an entire constellation, right? It's a map because
Mm,
I think that if, for example, weight gain is an issue, like we can talk about the macro structure and different things. I've also seen patterns where people don't detoxify particularly well, or they're struggling with mold, or they're struggling with sleep, or something like that, where their hormones and their nervous system is very much out of balance. I think that that gives your body a lot of reasons to be holding on and storing calories as well.
yeah.
So as we also dive into the mood and behavior side of things, there's going to be a lot of connection points between all these different systems that we're talking about. With regard to satiety, I actually look at a few different things at once. And I look at the more zoomed in genes that I already mentioned, being FTO, which is unfortunately named the fat and obesity gene. I think it could have been named something a little more appropriate, but nevertheless, FTO. And that actually has this idea of a connection of your gut to your brain. Like Dr. K and I did a great webinar all about the gut brain axis. And I kind of think this is like a related concept. So when you start eating, right, and you start chewing your food and your stomach starts to prepare it with stomach acid elevation and different things, there's actually a signal that gets sent from the gut to the brain to say, like, okay, we're good. You can go ahead and stop eating now. That signal is regulated by this FTO gene. And I'll tell you,
Mhm.
a lot of people have a dysregulation in this gene to where that signal in and of itself is really slow, right? Like it takes a while. Me too. I'm just like that. And I actually have relatives who thought I had a tapeworm at certain points because I could put food back. I mean, like I'm a pretty big guy, but I can put it back like crazy volumes of it. And sure enough, I'm totally dysregulated for FTO. So it's the signal, right? And by the time it hits your brain and says, we have had enough calories, you've already had the second or the third serving there, right? So
Mhm.
FTO is really important. Then the other one that I mentioned, MC4R, is the exact same idea, but it exists at the level of the palate instead of the level of the gut, right? So it's like you start chewing, all these different mouth sensations start to create a signal. Some people's signal gets to the brain a little bit quicker to where, hey, we're good, we don't need to eat anymore. And some people are a little bit slower with that signal as well. So imagine here if both of those signals are totally slow and dysregulated, I would say that that's going to definitely increase the likelihood of you overeating. Then I know we're going to get into the executive function panel, but I like to pair this with what we talk about with dopamine. Food
Yeah.
is highly dopaminergic. I mean, it's wired that way because our ancestors didn't just have convenience stores everywhere. When they finally got
Mhm.
their hands on that food, you can bet there was a corresponding dopamine spike that came with it, right? So if
And a
you're
dopamine
already a high binger or like a binger or an addict, as far as the dopamine pathway is concerned, and you're dysregulated for FTO and MC4R, that's pretty likely to be one of your vices, food, and
Yeah.
it's available on every street corner, and you can just totally binge and get an overabundance that our ancestors probably didn't have available, right? So this is even a dopamine conversation. I mean, all of these things are so relevant, Dr.
Mhm. Yeah. No, and I value that you've really positioned there that some people, for reasons that once upon a time were really advantageous, right? For reasons that food wasn't plentiful in the way that it was, this is kind of something that's lingering within us that we're going to be wanting as much as we can get because once upon a time we didn't really have access to that. And audience, especially those who are trying to ask, why do I always gain weight? I want you to hear that while you have full autonomy about what you're eating and you have full autonomy about how you're going to be supporting your health, there needs to be a gentleness with your experience of your body, that it's not a moral failing that you're always hungry. There's very much a genetic element that comes into that. And if you're someone with a suboptimal FTO or you're someone with a suboptimal MC4R, there are strategies. Right. So, Justin, why don't we talk a little bit? So, people come in and they have suboptimal one of these genes. They're struggling with those satiety signals. They're craving dopaminergically food. What are some really baseline advices that you have? And I know we said we weren't going to offer kind of general advice, but let's speak to a few high-level strategies that people can incorporate to kind of quash some of these cravings. What are you telling people?
I do a map of different things, I'll tell you, because some of these things are as simple as having kind of a gratitude practice surrounding your meals, right? Because I
Mhm.
think part of binging really has a lot to do with the fact that it's so available for us in the first place, right? And it's
Mhm.
like there's almost a disrespect going on there for the fact that there are people in the world that don't have any food. And up until very recently in our history, we didn't just have it right there without having to massively earn it, right? Like a lot of effort to get any calorie that you possibly could. That was the human experience for millennia up until very recently. So when we add in a little gratitude practice surrounding our food and we sit down and we try to eat in a parasympathetic state, we take a moment and we just say, hey, like, thank you, whatever you believe in, thank you for this food. That actually
Mhm.
gets your body and, believe it or not, your digestive system into a more receptive state for it. And it
Yeah.
can theoretically speed up that FTO signal a little bit.
Yeah.
So everything from that to the more hacky stuff. Like I'll share something that I do myself that I've found really effective. Because I'll tell
Mhm.
you, I'm a good boy up until the evening time. And then something in my head, just as soon as it's over, like the workload is over for the day, something in me just wants to bust into something and snacks and cheese and everything else. Not even unhealthy foods necessarily, but just a volume of it. And I can't shut it off. So, one thing that I do as a hack that actually has worked really well is I try to have a cutoff point for my food. I eat a big dinner. And then as soon as I'm done, what I do is I take a shot of these ketones and I drink
Mm,
some essential amino acids, right? So the
mm,
combo of
Oh, it's a
ketones
protein
and
buff.
aminos, very interesting combo here because your body has everything it needs to get you through the night, right? Like you're good for quite a while. If you take some
Mhm.
ketone esters, like really good, strong ketones, it doesn't require a ketogenic diet. You're not taking in fats to try to achieve ketosis here. You're upping blood ketones such that your energy systems have something to feed off of. You could argue that ketones are a fourth macronutrient, and it's something that your body immediately uses, and you can actually use it prior to sleep without a stimulant effect as well. So then the amino acids, I mean, it gives your body all of the things that your muscles need throughout the night to recuperate. So my body's not shouting at me, Justin, let's get some more protein. Let's get some more protein,
Mhm.
right? So ketones and aminos after my last meal of the day has been a really, really beneficial thing. And that's the start of my fast, right? So I eat from noon to 8. It's a 16 and 8, pretty basic intermittent fasting strategy. But at the very beginning of my fast, after that evening meal, I spike my ketones and it just gets me right
Mhm.
off to the races. And I'm pretty well good until noon the next day. So that's one of my hacks. I'm guessing you
Perfect.
don't really need anything like that. Hey, Dr. K, like you don't like you have the same genes as I do, but you don't strike me as being as crazy as I am with food, or are you? Am I accurate or no?
Oh, no, you're 100% wrong. I will
Really?
inhale food. It takes a lot of food to be this tiny. I don't mean to make light of it. No, I eat a lot, but I think I really focus, especially my evening meal. One of my priorities when I look at my plate is a lot of protein, a lot of fat, as well as a lot of fiber, right? So for those that really struggle with some of that satiety signaling, one of the ways that, and this is purely an anatomical thing, right? I'm looking at physical signals. How can I physically signal to my body that I am full? What fiber does, especially when it goes into your stomach, is it pushes against the walls of your stomach. And that is a physical signal to brain to say, hey, we got something going on here. You can slow down. We probably can't take much more food in. And then that also slows how that food moves through, which will not only buffer how those sugars are going to be going through. Remember, audience, at the moment you kind of get that sugar bump within the body, it's going to crash and then you'll get really cravey, right? You're going to get a lot of cravings. So a lot of fiber to do that, but then also just to have it slowly work the way through the track. So I'm not as susceptible to cravings. And just also a shout out to the women on this call who are still menstruating. Where you sit in your cycle is going to markedly change how much you're craving. First half of the cycle, you're a little bit more estrogen dominant. Estrogen has a natural appetite suppressing effect. So that first half, especially if you've started a new way of eating in that first half, it's probably going to be a little bit easier because estrogen's coming into body and saying, yeah, you don't need to be as hungry. We're kind of happy and dancing around the world. Once you hit that second half of your cycle, that second half of your cycle where there's going to be more progesterone and body's like, maybe we have a baby, we should probably toss in more food just in case we do, because we're going to need that energy, right? That's the point of the cycle where you're going to be craving more things. And just simply being aware of that when you walk into that, I'm good for the first half. I can keep a very balanced diet, no nighttime snacking. Second half, good Lord, like don't block me from the fridge because it's all coming in. But with that awareness, I just make sure I have really, really, really good fiber rich, protein rich snacks in my house that I enjoy eating, that don't feel like punishment. That all will kind of help leveling that out. And it takes practice, right? It takes practice. I'm not gonna sit here and preach and say it's easy. There are definitely times I am knobbing on all the chips and the candy, but it just takes practice and awareness of how that makes your body feel after the fact. Yeah, so why don't we jump a little bit into oh yeah, I'm seeing some women comment that they feel they feel me on this. So yes. Why don't we jump into some of the executive function or the cognitive genes, Justin, that play into this. So audience, again, we're still within that mood and behavior section. Do you want to jump into some of the cognitive genes that not even from a satiety perspective, but more from that anxious awareness that have us reaching for I won't call it a vice. My best friend is chocolate. All the chocolate has me reaching for chocolate. Let's talk about those, Justin.
As long as you have good quality cacao, with like rich in antioxidants and polyphenols, that's a great alternative to the Snickers and things. Um, but chocolate in and of itself, I must say I'm a fan as a health food if it's right for you, definitely. The
My
volume matters though, folks. Don't think it doesn't. Um, I'll highlight a gene here that I actually think is not often talked about in relation to food, because we
Mm,
talk about it from generally a little bit more of a zoomed in perspective with regard to noradrenaline and just general anxiety. The gene I'm referencing here is in your mood and behavior profile, and it's called ADRA2B. So this is strongly correlated with the noradrenaline receptor itself. So believe it or not, a lot of people have difficulty with the actual utilizing of noradrenaline, right? Which is epinephrine. There's different names for it, but really this is what gets released in response to that fight or flight kind of a mechanism. And it can really lead to predispositions for things like post-traumatic stress, um, general anxiety disorder, right? GAD. A lot of people who struggle with anxiety, we find that they have deletions in this particular gene. And that's what we measure it as. There's things called indels or deletions. So when you go into your profile, there's going to be I's or D's next to this gene. If you've got two I's, that's great. That represents the full version of the gene. If you've got a D in there, then that represents a deletion. And that's going to decrease your ability to deal with noradrenaline. Heaven
Yeah.
forbid you're like Coach Justin and you've got a double deletion, right? Both D's there, and you just basically missing the receptor. So it's really difficult for some of us to actually handle and manage our anxiety. That's why I train boxing. That's why I lift. That's why I do breath work. All these
Yeah.
things manage my emotions, especially as a man, because it's also, I have a lot of testosterone as well. And I think anxiety and testosterone together can lead to some pretty antisocial behavior for a lot of men. And that's another topic for a different webinar. But I'll say that I do think that a lot of people overeat as an anxiety response. Like it's like something that we have control over. I think that a lot of anxiety, it's because we have this feeling of being out of control. We can't control
Mhm.
our destiny. We can't control our environment, and it causes us a lot of anxiety. And if we have deletions in that ADRA2B, we can't manage the requisite noradrenaline that gets released. So it's
Yeah.
circulating more. It takes longer to clear. It's very difficult. And I think that we just sort of reach for something, right? And
Yeah.
socially, there's certain things that are not acceptable for you to reach for. But you can absolutely go to a restaurant and you can
Yeah.
absolutely reach for food over and over again. So I'll share something interesting here as well. I do not have binging tendencies directly in my genes. I have
Mhm.
medium prompt, which is what clears dopamine. I have a medium dopamine receptor. So I don't inherently have a binging tendency. And yet, I have in fact struggled with binging tendencies in my life.
Mhm.
But I have a double deletion for that ADRA2B and dysregulation in the satiety factors that I mentioned earlier, being MC4R as well as FTO. So to me, why would I binge on food? I really think it's more of an anxiety response for people like myself than it is an actual baseline binging response. Like if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And I want to gently bring into this conversation serotonin, because I think that will offer a bit more context to why people might be reaching for food when they're stressed and the adjure may not be serving them well, and also transition us into the gut. So a lot of time when people are reaching for, like when they're going through that binge or they're reaching for things they're craving, let's be honest, by and large, they tend to have a high volume of carbohydrate. And the reason for that is carbohydrate is just sugar. And once it's in the gut, that sort of thing will help be a precursor and kind of kick off serotonin production. Okay. And serotonin is, I know a lot of people, traditionally have associated it with a happy gene, or sorry, a happy neurotransmitter. And there's truth to that. But the bigger truth and the reason it kind of gets associated with happiness is serotonin is the neurotransmitter that gives us a hug. It is the neurotransmitter that makes us feel comfortable and cozy, right? You think about having a bad day, the one thing you want to go home and do is maybe get a hug and cuddle up in a fuzzy blanket. And that is quite literally what serotonin does. It has many roles, but from a comfort perspective, that's what it does. And so a lot of people, when they're not feeling stressed, right? When they are feeling stressed, reaching for a carbohydrate that will kick off that serotonin production is intuitive. You may not be able to tell me the biochemistry behind it, but you can tell me that after you've had that piece of cake, you're like, oh, and then it felt like my body took a little bit of a sigh and I felt a little bit better. And that was kind of the kickoff of the serotonin there. Right. And so I wonder, Justin, I want to make sure that I know we have a lot of questions. Within the Q&A. So I want to make sure we honor that, but I do want to transition into the gut before we jump into those questions and answers. And I think serotonin's that perfect point to do that. So do you want to talk about why we're talking about serotonin in the gut and how the gut and the biome really feed into everything that we've just talked about? The calories you're extracting from your food, what how your food influences the way you feel, how your food influences appetite. Kick us off because I know you know the gut and you love the gut.
The gut is so interesting. Like you can study it for your entire life and never actually understand all the different things that are going on there, you know. And when we talked about gut brain axis, we talked about a lot of the different microbiota that exists there. It is so massive and there's so many different moving elements to it. And I'll tell you, they call it the second brain for a reason because large amounts of neurotransmitters, as well as neuromodulators like dopamine, get created in the gut. Same with melatonin. I mean, this impacts your sleep, it impacts your digestion, your thyroid, it impacts all of your endocrine system. I mean, there's a lot of connective tissue within the gut. And I think another interesting thing is that if we have a gene already dysregulated, right? So we look at the 5-HTTLPR gene for the serotonin receptor, but when I have that conversation with patients, I also loop it right in with the gut conversation because I
Mhm.
say you might have a totally, high quality receptor. There's L's there, which means it's a longer receptor, which is great. But if you have gut dysbiosis going on, then you're still going to have potentially a lot of issues with serotonin because 80% of it is made right there in the gut, right? So we know that the gut is more not us than it is us, right? It's more bacterial than it is actual human cells by a factor of about 10. There's 10 times more bacterial cells that are not human there than are human, which is incredible to think about. And these different cells are doing different things in the body. Some of them are fermenting carbohydrates. Some of them are creating short chain fatty acids, which are anti inflammatory. Some of them are creating
Mhm.
neurotransmitters or facilitating the metabolism of neurotransmitters. So these are directly
Mhm.
impacting the other brain, the one that's in between your ears.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I mean, with our gut 360 that we look at, right, which has got a lot of incredible info on there, one of the things that we look at is Candida species, right, which
Mhm.
is like this. We call it an opportunistic species because it kind of finds its opportunity to work its way in. And once it's in, it's in. Like you have to have a whole eradication protocol to deal with it. Um, we look at a few different species of candida because we want to get an overall picture of how much is in there because
Mhm.
pathogenic species we don't necessarily want to eradicate all the way down to zero either. I talked about this on our other webinar. They are a form of hormesis, right? If you're not familiar with that concept, a little bit of stress has beneficial things for the body, too much of it not so much. So we want a little
Mhm.
bit of pathogenic species in the gut because it keeps your immune cells on guard and circulating and ready
Mhm.
to attack something. What we
Mhm.
don't want is way too much presence of these proteolytic bacteria because they can cause dysbiosis and they can cause a lot of issues. One interesting thing that we see when you have a lot of candida is that people tend to crave the heck out of sugar because we know that candida feeds off of sugar, right? So it's like it actually impacts the way that you crave different foods based on your microbiota that are present in there. And candida will
Yeah.
make you want a lot more sugar. If you're an anxious person and you have candida overgrowth, gosh, I mean, you're going to be
Mhm.
wanting sugar all day and all night, and you're not going to really understand the reason why until you have a microscope to really look at what's in there.
Yeah. 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 And I think I'm grateful that we're starting to bring in the idea that we are as much biome as not. Because I think in medicine, sometimes that was one of the bigger missing pictures. It was the gap between like your genes say this and yet your body's expressing this, right? And it's because of that influence. And I think one of the really neat things that our test does, and this is through the magic, and I mean that so very sincerely, the magic of AI, is that once we're able to appreciate the little buggos within your body and what the patterns are telling us, are they setting you up for metabolic disorder? Are they setting you up for cognitive decline, et cetera? We're able to, because we have big computing power in AI, play with that and say, like, if you were with this current spread of bugs to change your diet to a vegan diet or change your diet to a paleo diet, would your biome respond positively? Would your biome shift in a way that is metabolically favorable? Would your biome shift, or would it shift in the opposite way? And I think that's a really powerful thing that if we're able to take the profile of the gut and say, on a digital AI replication, right? Say, if we were to give you a vegan diet, would that be good, bad, or ugly if we were to do paleo? And so sometimes that can be really helpful in terms of diet advice. Not only do we know genetically speaking, right, what is going to work really well for you, separate and apart from that, and that's so powerful. How is that going to mesh up with the fact that you're more bug than not, which creeps me out to no end, but is kind of also very neat.
Yeah, I just look at it from the neat perspective. And I'll tell you, I mean, I do think that that's relevant for some of the shortcomings of these really restrictive diets. You know, like I know, Dr. K, you and I are both fans of elimination diets, for example, as strategies for identifying intolerances and things in the body. But these are really something that I myself, and I'm sure Dr. K as well, uses as more of a short-term structured thing to identify this or that. But when we talk about like really restrictive, like, okay, so this webinar is about trend diets. I don't know that I'd call the carnivore diet a trend. I do think it's here to stay, but I think that I've always viewed it as a tool, right? And it's something that you can
Mhm.
utilize, and I do believe can have some benefit. But if your genes and your gut makeup aren't really aligned with that, and we cut out all plant sources, I think one of the problems that can present itself there is that the reduction of alpha diversity in the gut could be an issue you run into later on, right? So
Yeah.
that's where a lot of these really restrictive diets I think can be done more in a cyclical basis. Like, for example, I do like the idea of tailoring your diet to the seasons, right? The times of
Mhm.
year. That's a pretty cool thing. In
Yeah.
Canada, we have an actual winter and we have an actual summer. So in the winter, just like the ancestral elements that I talked about earlier with the Inuit people, there's
Mhm.
times when the earth doesn't give us produce where we live. The only reason we have produce is because we can ship it in from other countries, which is actually a man made thing that isn't entirely natural. So sometimes I'll cut my carbohydrates more in the wintertime and then add in more fruits and things like that, seasonal, you know, local,
Mhm.
all those kinds of things in the summer. And it almost operates like a elimination diet, but just for a period of the year. You know, so these are the things we get into in our coaching practices. There's so many fun ways that we can manipulate this.
Yeah, and I think manipulate, but also make it feel natural in the sense of it's no longer a diet. It's something that you want to do because you know how good you can feel from it. And I think that's an important like mental shift. Audience, you told us a lot of people are trying to work on why do I gain weight and how do I shift that? So I would speculate, well, there's some people here that are, dieting for a health goal. There's going to be other that are dieting for weight loss and shifting from that adversarial relationship with food where I have to eat this way and I don't enjoy it to, oh, wow, I want to eat this way because it makes me feel so great is an important jump that I think genetics and informed eating can be very supportive there.
Absolutely.
Justin,
And
you're
I
amongst
kind
the
of,
best there.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you very much. I look at it like plugging it through filters almost, you know, like I'll take what an appropriate diet would sound like, right? Like an ancestral diet. And then you plug it through the filter of the genes. You plug it through the filter of the microbiome. You plug it through the filter of their body composition goals. You plug it
Yeah.
through the filter of their gut status, you know, all these different things. And what you
Mhm.
arrive at is the ideal circumstance, right? Like the best
Yeah.
case scenario that we can create. If you were to have stopped at that first step and just go, I heard paleo is good, here's paleo. I heard keto is good,
Mhm.
here's keto. We're not going to arrive at the optimal circumstance for this person. We got to plug it through them, their
Right.
lifestyle, their genes, and then what it trickles down to is the best case Ontario, as we say in Canada. So I'm from Kamloops. I almost said Kamloops there, but Canada.
All right. And on that note, I want us to transition into questions and answers because audience, you've offered us quite a few, and we'll start with Peter, who is eager to the jump and got his question first. So, um, Peter, I would imagine if you've been able to listen to the fullness of this webinar, we've answered your question a little bit. But for the audience, what Peter's saying is he's a retired firefighter. So thank you, Peter. Traveling in the US. Can you give me the best, most simple recommendation to help lose some weight that he's gained over the past couple of years? He's 60 years old, and Justin, you can see this. He's listed a few of his genes, and so Peter, the first thing I would say is we'd actually want to see the full panel because what you've offered us is helpful, but there's actually a lot more information. And I think there has to really be that personalized intake to really look at what are you currently eating, etc. Justin, I wonder if you could briefly, though, for Peter, speak to the connection between men getting older and that weight gain that he's mentioning there, because I think there's a little bit of a seed. So Peter, there's an element of we need to see more data. We want to be of support. Um, please reach out to us. You can use the email ceo@thednacompany.com if you want some more individualized support. But Justin, do you want to talk to, that kind of age that men are at when they start to see a little bit of this weight gain?
Yeah, so there's this phenomenon called andropause, right? And I actually just wrote an article about it for. I hope you guys all read the DNA Digest because we write some pretty bomb articles in there that are really useful. And I just wrote one about andropause and really some of the impacts that it has on men. And I'll tell you, it really, when our baseline testosterone starts to slow down, it makes it a lot harder for our body to partition macronutrients properly, right? This is an anabolic hormone that our body makes a lot of from puberty all the way up to what we call andropause, right? Same thing as menopause, it's just for us. So I would say that the diet is a great place to start. Lifestyle factors are going to matter a heck of a lot there as well, right? They're getting rid of, xenoestrogens and things in the environment. How can we amplify testosterone and growth hormone with our lifestyle? All of that is going to matter. But to try and give you a more concrete answer based on what you listed there, it looked like you had pretty good fat metabolizing genes and kind of a moderate starch metabolizing gene. Um, I would say that to me, at a baseline here, remember there's a lot more to consider, would represent a hybrid diet, right? So I would be careful about starches. And I would say only include them as far as maybe a post workout meal. You can do what I do, which is like carb backloading. I only have one meal a day that's carbs, but really prioritizing high quality proteins, some low lectin veggies, and then some high quality fatty acids as well, and then just cycle on and off of the carbohydrates. So you could do a carb cycling strategy, pair it with some intermittent fasting, etc. Those are great strategies at a baseline, but that's more of a general than a specific recommendation because I don't know your whole profile.
Love it. Yeah. So our next question is just from Lizette. I hope I'm saying that right. Their TCF7L2 is GG. What does that mean? And that you are amongst the blessed, and that is an optimal presentation. So you, at least from a genetic perspective, aren't at risk for diabetes and insulin dysregulation. This said, and I want to be very emphatic about this with the audience, absolutely anyone with any genetic profile can get diabetes. What TCF7L2 really tells us if in conditions of a bad diet, you're eating pure sugar all the time, how quickly will you get diabetes? So just be mindful of that. This is not protection against, it's really in bad circumstances, how quick will you? Dr. Yvette has asked us where Amy 1 is. And so just as a reminder to audience, Amy 1 can be found. Oh, there we go. I see actually Dr. Gabby has jumped into the chat and she's supporting with locating Amy 1. So I'll leave that to her. Dr. Yvette, if you want to jump into the chat, Gabby has replied, or Dr. Gutierrez, sorry, has replied to you directly. Next question is coming in from Lori. She's saying she also has, so Justin, Lori's in our camp, bad FTO, ApoA2, Amy 1, and get really confused around the best diets to eat, especially the best foods to be eating, especially for breakfast. So what would you give advice? So there's people like you, me, and it sounds like Lori as well, who the report says, you might be a bit sensitive to carbs and you might be a bit sensitive to fats, which is 100% me. Where do you start people off on kind of those considerations when at first blush, the report kind of says don't eat these two food groups, which is not true, but help our audience understand that a little bit.
Yeah, that's where the report can be a little bit baffling at first glance because really, the reports are very well made, but they are made on an algorithm and it's not going to pick up on each and everything that a practitioner might. That's why just a half hour session with a practitioner can go pretty far for some of these questions because you read the report and you're like, guess I can't eat food. So what else is there? Right? So one of the main things that I recommend is protein prioritization for people that have both suboptimal presentations of starches and fatty acids. Now, this doesn't mean zero fat and zero starches either, right? It
Mhm.
really is just a reduced ability to actually metabolize both of them, which is something that can be improved on, by the way, right? So let me give an example. If you were going to jump on a diet that has a little bit higher fat, but you do have the suboptimal ApoA2, there's all kinds of stuff we can do, right? You can pair it with fasting, you can pair it with ketones, you can pair it with lipase, like some of these enzymes that actually do the digesting of fat. L-carnitine is a great ingredient for helping push fat into the mitochondria. We can add sauna, cold exposure. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can improve the profile that aren't even necessarily diet related. But I'm a fan of protein prioritization because there's something called the thermic effect of feeding, which means that it actually takes a certain amount of calories to burn protein calories. And that's a pretty safe bet, right? Protein is something that's pretty reliable as far as maintaining muscle mass. So you don't end up with what's called sarcopenia, which is a really big problem, right? Like the loss of muscle as we age. And then it's just a matter of letting the fats naturally occur and being really, strategic about when and where and why we add in some of those starches. And I'll tell you, the nuances go further because even among starch sources, right, there's strategies like cooking and cooling. If you cook and cool rice or you cook and cool potatoes, they're now a resistant starch, and it's likely not going to give you the same blood sugar spike and insulin response as it would when it was fresh and still hot. There's a lot of things that we can do to manage the blood sugar response. We can time the starches for after your leg day, and you're probably going to load your glycogen up and use a lot more of it in a beneficial manner. Um, so a coaching call, that's what I recommend because there's so much to go on with these questions.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot within the question and answers. People are listing out their genes and saying, please advise, and appreciate that it's very difficult for us to respond to that because quite literally every person in this audience has different genes and different gene combinations. So hear what we're saying in, especially when Justin says like, hey, if you have a suboptimal ApoA2, here are some thoughts, hear that, incorporate it. And if you want a further tailored plan that's very specific to you, please again, do reach out to us at CEO at the DNAcompany.com, and we can figure out, how we best support your understanding of self and get you into a program or a visit with a clinician simply to get more exacting advice. So, Ina, Barbara, I hope that's helpful to you guys as well, what Justin has just talked about now. So Lauren is also saying they're struggling to find a few things within their report. So Lauren, Dr. Gutierrez might be able to help you with that as well. If you just want to toss a comment in the chat, Dr. Gutierrez can connect with you in finding that information in the report. All right. So Cindy is asking for a little bit of clarification around AMY1. So AMY1, as Justin talked about, is a gene that's very specific to salivary amylase that is produced that supports signaling within the body and carb digestion. They're saying that they're super addicted to carbs and starches and they're so delicious and it's difficult, even though they have this suboptimal presentation, to break away. Any thoughts or any support that you have there?
Yeah, so I think that she was also referencing. So I had mentioned a few things about saliva and how it changes pH of food and it kind of preps the digestive system. I understand that when it comes to the gene, I just meant that that's how we test it, right? Like that's where we find it. It's a salivary amylase gene, so that's where it is. It's not necessarily going to, in and of itself, mean that saliva is going to increase or decrease your ability to digest the starches, but the gene gives us an indicator as to how your metabolic processes work. It is kind of a problem if you make low saliva as far as your ability to digest all your food, right? Like it's very valuable and it's a useful thing. Um, I suggest, I mean, when it comes to starches, making them a resistant starch, like I mentioned, is a very useful strategy. Doing all the other things that we talked about, right? So the ketones are great. Things like coffee have appetite suppressing effects that can be useful. You can use berberine and cinnamon and apple cider vinegar to help get rid of the blood glucose a little bit quicker, so it's not impacting the energy systems as much. But really, my advice is timing it properly is so valuable, right? So, like, giving yourself a starch meal every day, but making sure that you do it after your workout. That's a nice way of looping your dopaminergic system into the accomplishment of a task first, right? To where there's less downside. Personally, I'm actually a fan of also this strategy of going for a walk after your meals. I know people kind of go back and forth as to the science of that. I think it's a good
Mm.
idea. What do you think on that, Dr. K? Like, do you think it's a good call to go for a walk after, especially a starch meal?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, remember, audience, there's two different ways that we can bring sugar from the blood into the body. One is through insulin, and the other one is quite literally through physical movement. So as you're physically moving, what will happen is there's certain gates that will open that accept sugar in from the blood into the body, because the idea is, if you're running away from something big and scary, you don't want to be waiting for insulin. You want to know that you can directly pull that sugar from the blood in to fuel your muscles to keep you running away from whatever is scary. So especially if you're working on blood sugar regulation, I really, really, really do like that. And I also think in general, we within North America do not move enough. And I'm not talking about high intensity movement. I'm talking about, we sit in these chairs in these offices more than we should be. And that in general is deleterious to our health. Um, Something else, Cindy, I'd want you considering. So, as a female, if you're still menstruating, I would be very conscious of, actually, hold on, let me back up one. And this is for the full audience. This is not just applicable to women. Our taste buds turn over approximately every 3 weeks. What does that mean? If you're to start, if you're probably eating a lot, you're used to kind of that very sweet taste or that sweeter taste within the mouth, and your taste buds are used to that. They're attuned to that. And so if you were to change your diet and strip it out of mostly sweet things, reduce it the way that Justin just mentioned, it's going to take approximately 3 weeks for your taste buds to acclimate. So I would really get into this. I would plan for at least 3 weeks and kind of recognize that the first few weeks are gonna suck because your taste buds are like, I want sweet, and you're not giving it to them. So there's gonna be a little bit of within the body. So with the awareness, it's going to take approximately 3 weeks to recalibrate. Focus as well on your cycle, right? You don't want to be starting this in the middle of your progesterone, right? Where you're not going to necessarily have that craving control that you may in the first half. So I'd really recommend be mindful of the 3 weeks and be mindful of when you start this in relation to your cycle, because we want to set you up for success. I don't want to ask you to do the impossible a few days before your period when all you want is the carbs. So just something to be thinking through as well. All righty. Um, all right. So Lynn is asking the question around FUT2, especially in relation to plant-based diets. Justin, do you want to explore this topic a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting topic, and I will say that it's pretty in the conversation now, within
Mm,
our ecosystem. Ever since 2019, when people really started talking a lot about plant toxins, plant defense chemicals, ever since then, this has been a pretty big conversation. Oxalates and phytic acid and lectins. You really, plants can give off certain things that are definitely can be detrimental to the gut microbiome, and it doesn't necessarily manifest as weight gain. So, like, oxalates are a great example for that. Like, spinach has a lot of nutrients in there, but there's also oxalate in there, which can, in fact, inhibit the absorption of nutrients because the nutrients are actually in there for the spinach plant. So, some people, if you don't have the right enzyme activity to deal with the oxalate, you can be taking one step forward and one step back, right? Interfering with calcium channels and different things. FUT2 is of relevance there because we look at it in kind of two different lenses. We look at it with regard to B12 absorption in the gut, and we also look at it as a defender against things like lectins and some of these plant compounds that can be problematic. if you feel good and you don't have any health issues and you eat things, I mean, it's coming right out of your garden based on this question. So you're getting a good source at least. And there is ways that
Mhm.
you can, cook and sprout and ferment. And there are ways to downgrade some of these plant defense chemicals while simultaneously increasing the availability of some of the micronutrients in the plants. So there's different
Mhm.
ways that you can process the food itself to make it a little bit more useful for you. This would also be one of those circumstances where I do recommend food sensitivity testing. We've talked quite a bit about that. IgG testing to understand what foods exactly are causing an immune response in your gut.
Mhm.
If all the foods you just listed there are not causing an IgG response, that's a pretty good indicator that your body specifically, somebody else's might
Mhm.
not, but you do okay with that particular food. And it's pretty surprising some of the results that will come back on that. So, well, for you, I would honestly recommend doing one of these IgG food sensitivity tests. That way, you know.
Yeah, and I think this brings up another good point insofar as when we think about diets, sometimes moral, ethical, larger concerns that are not centered in body can be a determiner of what diet people want to be eating. I was plant-based for a very, very long time, and I saw a lot of my people in my practice that were also plant-based. And I'll be plain, I don't have a genotype that is supportive of that, but I was that way for a very long time and I was very healthy. And so, if you have a genotype that is not supportive of being plant-based, is it possible? Yes. But I would really, really, really encourage you work with a provider in order to fine tune that diet because it's kind of you're walking uphill there. You're fighting against what is natural within your body, and you have to be very strategic to ensure you get proper protein, minerals, etc., vitamins, because it's not going to be natural in your body to do that. So can you? Sure, but you have to work really, really hard at it, and you really have to be mindful of when you're choosing the plant-based diet for reasons that are outside of health and wellness to do it intelligently, or else you're not going to enjoy your experience of plant-based diet. So I hope that's helpful, Lynn. All right. The next question we have here is from Kirsten. So Kristen, and she's asking for FTO and MC4R. So these are appetite satiety genes. If she has T's across the board, so just a bunch of T alleles, is that optimal? The answer is yes. And I'd encourage Kristen and other people, if you guys are struggling to find within your DNA 360 what is optimal, please do reach out to our team through the comments or to Dr. Gutierrez directly. We can support your understanding of that. In the interest of time, I probably won't address too many more of these questions of if this presentation, then what does that mean? Please do reach out to us in the chat so we can support you finding that information within your DNA 360 because it is there. All right. Justin, a lot of people are asking for brand recommendations of ketones and amino acids. So I wonder, just quickly for the audience, do you want to give a few suggestions of brands that you like? And I know we have a cross-border audience. A lot of people call in from Canada. A lot of people call in from the US. Give them a heads up if the product is available in both jurisdictions or if you have to substitute based on one country or the other.
Yeah, so there's definitely a couple of brands that I'm a big fan of, and these are not affiliated brands. They're just I'm a biohacker and I try different stuff, and if it works for me, it works for me, and if not, then I'll say what it is. But the ones that I've arrived at would be for the ketones. There's one called Ketone IQ from a company called HVMN. That is an acronym for Health Via Modern Nutrition, and it's pretty unique. So, back when ketone salts first came on the market, they were beta hydroxybutyrate. They were attached to a sodium molecule, and they were these salts that were pretty much as effective as like an MCT oil, maybe a little bit better for causing the liver to release some ketones. Beneficial, valuable, and that's great. Ketone IQ is different because it's almost a form of an ester, but it's even more advanced than a typical ester. So it's a form of ketones called R13 butane diol, and it's the most strong type of ketone that you can get. They actually created it via a $6 million contract with the United States Department of Defense because Navy SEALs and Marines and things, they go long periods of time, sometimes without eating, right? They're in a very stressful situation. They have to remain cognizant. Sometimes they're sleep deprived. They're in and out of cold water. I mean, they really need like energy efficiency at that point in a really dangerous job, right? And dangerous mission, things they have to do. So ketones, they give you that appetite satiation. They also increase cognition and really give your body, like I mentioned, it's almost a fourth macronutrient. So it gives your cells, your mitochondria, a little something to work with very easily. It tastes like rocket fuel. Don't expect it to be awesome. I do believe they have flavored ones out now, like green apple and things. Um, but it comes with a literal shot glass, right? And you take 1 to 3 ounces per day. You just literally take a shot of it, and it's going to give you many metabolic benefits. And what I like about it is it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife, as far as like you can put it anywhere in your regimen, and it's going to be useful. You can take it pre-workout, post-workout, during a fast. You can take it pretty much with a carb meal and be pushed right back into a state of ketosis that you would only otherwise access via a very long fast and all the restriction of proteins and things that you would have to do first. So it's a very valuable tool, and the essential amino acids work great right alongside it because it gives your body the building blocks that it needs to build and maintain muscle mass, as well as neurotransmitters and all the things that are amino acid dependent. So the amino acids I use, there's two brands. There's one called MAP, MAP. I know Dr. Laura loves MAP. She uses those ones
Mhm.
often. So it's Dr. Laura uses it. It's a good brand. And I also use Kion. So Kion. Granted, this has to do with my man crush on Ben Greenfield, and that's fine. Um, but it's all
I
of the
love that you
amino
disclose
acids.
that. Love it.
I shouldn't say that on these webinars, but
No, it's great. Sure.
I've learned a lot from him. Hey, he's got a great
It's
podcast.
amazing. No
Um,
hate, no hate. It was endearing. That was it.
he's the man. What I like about these is that so these are called EAAs, right? So essential basically means that it's every amino your body doesn't make on its own. So it has to get it through exogenous sources. And there's pretty delicate ratios between some of these amino acids to really get the best benefits out of it. And Kion has a really great blend. They did a lot of research. It's naturally sweetened with stevia, so you don't have a bunch of sucralose and artificial sweeteners, or you can get capsule forms as well. So I just, shot of the ketone IQ, glass full of the EAAs, and I'm off to the races from Kion.
Love it. Thank you, sir. All right, Cindy has our next question, and she says that after almost dying from mycotoxin poisoning, it took almost 5 years to start gaining some weight back, but she's still extremely lean and really struggling to put back on weight in spite of what sounds superficially, or at least as she reports it, a really good diet. So Cindy, I would encourage, if you're interested in this, feel free to reach out to a CEO at the DNA company. This is beyond the scope and capacity of a webinar. We're happy to work with you and support. Obviously, I would speculate there's still something going on with body if there's such resistance to put it on. One of the first places I'd want to start with would be a biome test, right? Along with blood work, just to surveil what's going on, because that's not what you would be expecting. I'd also be curious, is there still something, especially from that biome perspective, that's still not settled properly? So I hope you reach out to us, and we'd love to support you through that, because that sounds very harrowing. So let us know how we can be of support. Let's see here. Olive is asking the question. Okay. Is there a publicly available database of cravings and the possible genetic component or gene, if uh, if DNA testing is not available in our part of the world? So Olive, feel free to reach out to us. We deliver kits around the world, so we can definitely get you one. As to, is there a publicly available database? Absolutely. It's just not necessarily accessible insofar as it's very nerdy. But Snippedia tends to be one of my places, but I would really encourage you not to be so reductionist. Like, you're not going to find, like, if you crave chocolate, it means you have this gene, because I think there's a lot of things going on. There's the general idea that we've articulated here around satiety and genes influence that. But outside of that, I find people who have very specific health food cravings, oftentimes that's more reflective of a nutritional deficiency or something else that's going funky on in health. So, for example, people who crave chocolate tend to be looking for either something serotonergic, so calming, or magnesium, and there's a few other minerals in there. So I would step a little bit beyond that curiosity because I think there might be something going on there that diving into a genetic database, as fun as those are for people that wear spectacles, may not be of service to you. So reach out if that can be of help to you. Mr. Justin, since beans are your favorite thing in the world, Cynthia, oh, so close. I need new glasses. Cynthia is asking, do beans count as a non-starchy carb?
Beans are kind of a hybrid category, like there is a little bit of starch to them, but I wouldn't consider them a starch in the same way that a rice or a potato is like really definitely a starch. Definitely a carbohydrate, like beans certainly have carbohydrate to them and a little bit of protein as well. Beans are quite the category in and of themselves, like some people it's a great protein source and a great carbohydrate source. And for some people, it just wreaks havoc on their gut. Keyword being reeks, if you know what I mean. Um, so I have mixed emotions surrounding beans, but I do think that they can be an inclusion food. But there's going to be some starches to them, right? So it's not entirely starch free either. The way you cook those, by the way, is also going to be a pretty big factor as to how well you can orchestrate it into your diet. Like I mentioned, I mean, lectins and these different things can be somewhat deactivated based on how you actually cook them. Different things can be sprouted, fermented, soaked, etc. I think beans would be in that category, but I'm not against them. I think that when we talk about carbohydrates, we need to remember like it's a pretty big category, right? Like food of like fruit variety that has carbohydrates, honey has carbohydrates, maple syrup, coconut water. There's even carbohydrates in the form of lactose that's in your yogurt, right? So carbs are one thing, but
Mhm.
starches are another thing. And when you have suboptimal starch presentation in your genes, we're talking a little bit more about the real starches being rice and potatoes and things. Dr. K was plant based for so long. Did you have issues with beans, or like did you find they were tolerable for you?
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, I prepared them like I would soak and I would kind of prepare in more of a traditional way. Um, and no, but it was also one of those things too, you ease yourself into it. Body needs to get ready and used to it because it's really speaking to biome. And I think a lot of people, when they try to jump on the bean train, right, they're either, not soaking and not preparing traditionally, and separate to that, kind of inundating their body in way too much of a way. So
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of how do you do it? And then how are you transitioning into it? Yeah, but all right. Bethany has our next question. They said that we mentioned serotonin kicking off, being kicked off in food, especially when you're consuming carbohydrates. And they asked if you're a homozygous presentation of an MTHFR gene, how that impacts food and cravings. Um, so I would really encourage, I wonder if Annie and Julius, you can put up a link to last night's webinar. So last night, Dr. Steady and I dove really deep into methylation. We really explored MTHFR in both views. Of the two SNPs of MTHFR, and I apologize, this is a bit of a technical conversation right now. Of the two SNPs, interestingly, it's actually the other SNP that's a little more influential on mood. And so I wouldn't say there's a direct correlation to diet. Granted, if you have a suboptimal SNP of a certain MTHFR, you do have a bit more mood dysregulation if you're not properly supporting it, which then can feed into craving. But I think that's a little bit of a jump, and that wouldn't be one of the first places I would go to if I'm trying to connect diet and serotonin. But I think it's part of that constellation, not necessarily the first place I'd jump to. And hopefully last night's webinar can clean that up for you a little bit. Okay. All right. So Diane's asking or saying that a blood test showed that Candida was a number is that high. Diane, it's really difficult for us to know that because we need to know the marker the reference range, the units. There's a few different things that go into that. If you're looking for some support in interpreting that, or in particular, Justin's support as you kind of navigate what exactly is Candida, do you have it, and how do you address it? Feel free to reach out to us. It's a little bit difficult for us to be told Candida number without kind of that initial lab slip. Okay. And I think our last question of the evening is coming again from Cynthia. Uh, so Cynthia is saying, oh, I like this question. I'm grateful this actually hasn't come up. Audience, this is going to be some happy information to close us off with. Cynthia is saying that their diet nutrition profile tells them that they should avoid charred and burnt meats. Have up to 1 serving of grass-fed beef per week and a few servings of small fatty fish because they're very sensitive to toxins in meat. What about poultry? So I'm gonna pass the poultry question to Justin, but first I want to offer a little bit of education to our audience as to why we haven't really talked about the genetics of protein. So within the DNA 360, we're very exacting around here's how your body receives carbohydrates, here's how your body receives fats. We don't have a same here's how your body receives protein. And the reason for this is currently within literature, there are not a single or a collection of genes that give us insight into if I have one presentation and Justin has the opposite presentation, does that influence how we receive and digest protein? There are a few diseases, some frank mutations, but that's not really sitting within this normal population of how do I function best, right? That's a little more disease specific as opposed to function specific. So because there's not literature, we don't lie to our audience, we don't make up stuff. Because there's not literature, instead we took it from the perspective of, how are meats traditionally brought to our plate and how are they prepared? So we considered the animal food chain, right? And we also considered how are they prepared, right? Oftentimes with barbecuing and smoking, etc., all those different methods. And this is where we got to. We really said, of all the traditional ways, can a person absorb that toxin burden, right? Because we think about, as an animal goes through many typical food chains, they're really laden with antibiotics and a few other funky things. As an animal is prepared on a grill or whatever else it might be, there's going to be preservatives in it, there's going to be charring. So can the body, from a detox perspective, support that? So we're really not necessarily looking at the protein. Instead, we're looking at the accoutrement, everything that accompanies that protein, for better and worse. Okay. And so I would suspect, based on this, Cynthia probably does not have a great detox profile that can manage some of the carcinogens, et cetera, that come alongside. So Justin, do you want to add a bit more flavor to this question for Cynthia here?
Sure. And it's really, when we're talking about the body's capacity to handle toxins found in protein, understand as well the protein conversation in and of itself has several moving parts, right? As far as like proteolytic enzymes need to be considered, HCl
Mhm.
levels in the gut need to be considered. There's a lot of things that can indicate poor protein digestion as well. Like you can look at markers like indican to understand if you're really not digesting it very well. And that's going to be really independent of what kind you're actually taking in. There's also the sensitivities to consider, right? Like egg whites, for example, great source of protein, but a lot of people have sensitivities therein. As far as poultry is concerned, I would say that the same red flag would exist were you to barbecue it, right? I mean,
Mhm.
carcinogen load is carcinogen load, and it's going to be the same thing if you burn poultry. The other thing that I consider when it comes to this is the actual histamines that get created when meat is a little bit more left over. That's something that happens from both starches as well as protein, right? Like if you made, whether it is fish or grass fed beef or poultry, and you leave it in the fridge too long, it's going to create that histamine load as well that can be problematic for a lot of people at the level of the gut. So there's a lot going on
Mhm.
with it. Poultry is no exception to that. My problem with a lot of poultry is a few fold. It's a little bit harder to find pasture raised, like really well fed poultry products than it is beef, unfortunately. Chickens, I mean, God, we really screwed them over. Like, there's a lot of maltreatment, unfortunately, that goes on with that. And part of the maltreatment has to do with what they're being fed daily, right? Like they're being fed a lot of really omega-6 heavy grains, and there's some places where there's really no regulation at all. So what can happen is in the meat and in the skin and in the collagenous tissue, a lot of these omega-6s are storing up, and it's a really evolutionarily inconsistent level of linoleic acid that you end up with in a lot of chicken. So it can kick your omega-3 and 6 ratio off pretty quickly if you're not careful. And unfortunately, that's also impacting the chicken and their quality of life prior to them being butchered. But that being said, if you can find a high quality source, you don't burn it, you cook it and eat it within a relative time frame. I have nothing against that, and I don't think there's any reason genetically you can't have an inclusion there. I recommend mixing up protein sources, though. Some grass-fed beef is appropriate, and then some fish, and some eggs, and some yogurt, maybe even some beans. Again, alpha diversity, right? These things, the plethora of things that we can choose from. But be really careful with sourcing of poultry, just because of the reasons I mentioned.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Cynthia, for quite a one. I'm very grateful for that question because I think it rounded something out that we didn't directly address within this webinar. Justin, you're a gentleman and a scholar, and it is so delightful to have these conversations with you, especially that practical wisdom that you offer our audience. So thank you, sir, for being here. And
Thank you.
audience, oh, yes, Dorian. Audience, we show up for you, and we are so very grateful that you are here. So thank you for coming. Thank you for learning about yourselves, and thank you for incorporating the brilliant science that we have into your life. If you have any questions for us, do not hesitate to reach out. And I also encourage, if you want to see more of a way we presented, less of a way we presented different topics, do not hesitate to reach out to us. Again, we show up simply to the end of supporting you and helping you. So we'd love to know how we can help you better. And Justin, I think that brings us to our time where we get to dance out. And sir, I want to put you on notice. Dr. Steady, an epic dancer. We had great dance offs at the end. So this is, audience, we ensure that we dance out because when we think of exercise and activity that is protective and supportive of mental health, dancing was found to be the best. And so we dance out of these to ensure that we're supporting our best mental health and yours. Audience, until next week, thank you so very much for joining us. Merci beaucoup. And au revoir. Time to dance. Au revoir,
Thanks,
team.
everybody. And thanks, Dr. K. You're the best.
Vous aussi, monsieur.